Hello, everybody. It's 9 o'clock on Saturday night, and this is Starfleet Tactical, and I am Chris Weuve, as always. And so I'm solo tonight, although Lissa's behind the scenes. So, in fact, and so I've been bad about showing off the T-shirt because you may recall that a while ago I got a request that said always show off the T-shirt. So this one says, keep calm and set SCE to Ox, which of course is a reference to the moment in the Apollo 12 left off when they got hit by lightning and they lost their electrical system. And the electrical guy in Mission Control, whose name was John something. I can't remember. God, I can't remember his name. It's driving me crazy. He was the original steely-eyed missile man that was later referenced in The Martian. He was the steely-eyed missile man. And he said, tell him to set SCE to Ox, and they send it up to the capsule. And nobody knew what that meant, except one of the crewmen knew what that meant. And he said, I know what that means. And he reached down and flipped this switch that none of the rest of them ever knew about. And it basically went to the auxiliary bus. And as a result, they were able to land on the moon instead of having to abort as the rocket was heading up. So SCE to Ox is one of those. John Aaron, yes, John Aaron. He had a prominent role in Apollo 13. He was the guy who was the mission control guy who was leading them through the startup sequence and had Mattingly in the capsule, and they were flipping all the switches trying to figure out how to do the startup sequence. So he later was, I want to say he later ended up as the director of like the Houston, the Marshall Space Flight Center or the Kennedy Space Center or something like that. He retired as a fairly senior guy. So in any event, tonight we're going to talk about, let me pull up the screen. We're going to talk about how big is Starfleet? And, you know, that's a really good question. And I'm calling it an initial look because I can't really tell you how big Starfleet is. If you came expecting me to tell you how big Starfleet is, I'm not going to tell you how big Starfleet is. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about how to think about the problem of figuring out how big Starfleet is. That we can talk about. And so that's the plan for this evening. And with that in mind, so get the question, which era are we talking about? The answer to that is yes. And that's part of the issue, is because it really depends upon when you've been that. And so One Horse Shay says 12,000 to 15,000 starships in 2373. Yeah, I can believe that. But I can also not believe it. Let's go ahead and talk about what sort of goes into that. So here's the basic agenda. I think I added another slide on the end. I think that's the second to last slide there. What does Starfleet do anyway? I created another one and I forgot to add it to the agenda because, of course, I always have to forget something in the slides. And so that's basically what we're going to go through today. And so it's a relatively short presentation. It's only like 12 slides total. So we should be done early, right? Melissa is just laughing in the background here. I can see.
Say that.
Yeah.
There will be anecdotes galore, and it will still take the hour and a half.
Yeah, every time I say we're going to be done early, it ends up being a long show. So we'll see. And now, one thing I will say, though, about this show is those of you who have been on longtime viewers of this show, there's going to be a lot of stuff that you're going to say like, yeah, I think we've heard this before, right? This is not new. I think this strikes me as being something that's he's mentioned this before. And so, yes, that's the case with a bunch of this stuff. I'm taking a bunch of pieces and pulling it together because it's all of relevance in terms of thinking about the big picture, right? Because that's what this show is about. It's about understanding how real world naval history works. It's about understanding how Star Trek and other science fiction things work and how you can put it all together. And so I'm taking a lot of different, I'm taking the Legos that we've talked about in other contexts and I'm rebuilding it into something new. And so that's part of what's going on. The other part of this is I'm always very upfront. I'm more than willing to revisit topics again and sometimes again and again, because I will have more to say about them. And I also don't want this to turn into a show where, in order for you to follow, episode number 179, you have to have watched 1 through 178, right? So I know that we get new people all the time. I know that people don't necessarily remember something that I did 100 shows ago. And so it's always good to sort of have a refresher on this stuff and create shows that are intended to be sort of standalone in and of themselves. And so I don't have a problem with going back and talking about a topic again. I just try to make sure that every time I do it, I add some value to it and make it part of a relevant conversation. So everybody should think about questions as I'm going through this, because that's what we're going to do. But first is always the usual admin slide. So I suppose I could have made that font a little bit bigger, but it basically boils down to that next week, no show, because next week I'm going to go visit Merle Robinson. So Merle was my guest last week on the show. I'm expecting to see him more often. Actually, he's got 1 or 2 presentations he wants to do in the show, and the plan is to sort of have him be on more often. But I'm going to go visit him, and I'm going to go visit the Weuve Strategic Book Reserve that's located at Beaver Valley Self-Storage in Beaver Creek, Ohio, and spend some time trying to cull through the books and sort of prep them to move to my new location in Virginia. On the 19th of December, I expect to do a show. And then on the 27th of December, I'm tentatively planning to go back to Beaver Creek and do another iteration there. It's possible that I might do that. I might do a show on the 27th and not do a show on the 3rd. I could swap that around, but we'll see how that goes. Right now, I'm planning on doing it the way that it's marked there. And then I've got plenty of things to do in terms of topics. And it's sort of funny, I was thinking about which one of those I was going to do. And at some point I just said, I want to do something on the size of Starfleet, because I saw an episode of on YouTube, something popped up in my YouTube feed about this, about what the size of Starfleet was. And it was a YouTube channel that I have since unsubscribed from. I've just kind of decided it's not worth the effort. And so I don't want to, as a general rule, I'll say positive things about other people on YouTube. And I'll gladly identify people that I have high opinions of, even if there's some qualifications involved. But if it's somebody who I don't think is worth the effort, I won't tell you who it is. And so this is somebody I don't think is worth the effort anymore. So I decided, but he did inspire me to do this as a topic. And I sort of thought about it a little bit and realized, okay, this is something that I can actually kind of do and pull together a bunch of stuff from a bunch of different episodes and things that I've been thinking about, et cetera, and sort of construct the framework without actually getting towards an answer. And so, like I said, I'm not going to actually tell you how big Starfleet is for 2 reasons. First of all, it's a big question, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And second, I would argue the evidence is so inconsistent that I'm not sure I can reach a conclusion about it. And, I know that occasionally you see things here and there. There's some stuff, I know there's stuff in beta canon. I know there's stuff in Fanon. I know that there may even be stuff in alpha canon about it, but I frankly don't believe any of it, because when it comes to things like this, it doesn't seem to make any sense. I don't think that they've really thought it through. But what I can do, and this is the words that I put in the YouTube description for it, what I can do is go through all the factors that make it a big question, talk about the inconsistencies involved, talk about how it compares and contrasts with the real world, and sort of tell you what you need to think about to try to answer that question. And so that's what I'm going to do. And so I will consider it a victory if in the end, everyone understands what all the issues are and we've had a good conversation about it. So if everybody comes away kind of understanding how to think about the problem, then it'll be a win. So let's see if we can do that. And so Bob's telling me that I got the dates wrong, the 13th and the 20th. All right, 13th and the 20th, everybody. 13th and the 20th. What did I put? The 12th and the 19th. Yeah, okay. 13th and the 20th. Sorry about that. Yeah, of course, today's the 6th, so it would have to be the 13th and the 20th. Let's see. Okay, so next one. So why is it a big question? Well, first of all, it's because the Federation is big. And it's constantly getting bigger over time because the Federation is expanding. And so there's also the question about what exactly is the Federation? Does the Federation have hard borders or not? What, you know, it's clearly exploring an area of space. Is that all claimed by the Federation? And what does it take to explore those areas of space? You know, we really only focus on one ship. Or in the case of Deep Space Nine, we focus on the stuff around the station. We don't really have a good feel for what's going on in the rest of the Federation. Like one of the things I've pointed out in the past is like, where are all the Ambassador class ships, right? We see Enterprise C in one episode. Did they only make one of that ship? Do we ever see other ships of that class? You know, for the original series era, we see things like the Miranda that are clearly derivations of that. Later on, we see in the TNG era, we see the Nebula. We see some other things that look like they're derivations of that, but we only see the Ambassador class. We don't see anything that looks like it's a derivation of it. Is that because it didn't happen? I think it's possible that that was a time period where Starfleet wasn't building ships like they were going out of style. I can make a good argument as to why they wouldn't be building a whole bunch of ships in that time period. And that argument goes like this. During the time of the original series and the time of the original movies, there is basically two major threats that the Federation is having to deal with. It's having to deal with the threat of the Klingons, and it's having to deal with the threat of the Romulans. Well, both of those threats go away. And so if the Federation, if Starfleet was building a lot of ships because they thought they might have to go to war, they've got those hulls already built. And even if they're building more hulls, those production lines are set up for serial production. They're cranking out Mirandas. They're cranking out Excelsiors. We see a lot of Mirandas and a lot of Excelsiors in the show, more so than we see anything else. Now, why is that? We all know that the real answer is because it's a television show and they had those models, right? We all know that that's the reason why. But in universe, I can tell the answer, I can give the explanation that those were serial production ships, and we just built a ton of them, just like the United States Navy built a ton of destroyers for World War II. And we kept those destroyers through the 60s. We lived off of those destroyers for 20 years and just kept them in service. And we had a whole bunch of them. And we used a lot of World War I destroyers in World War II because we had a whole bunch of them. In fact, I did an episode where I talked about the modularity of the four Pipers and about how they were able to pull engine modules out and put in very specialty modules, and they turned them into assault transports, and they did this and they did that and they did the other thing. And so I think that's what was going on with the Mirandas. I think the Mirandas are an incredibly good design. Not the best explorer because they have some speed limitations because they don't have a navigational deflector. So you use the Excelsior if you need an explorer. but they're certainly good for all the second line survey stuff. That's exactly what we see the Reliant doing at the beginning of Wrath of Khan. It's doing a second line survey of some place that the Federation has already been, right? They're not going out and exploring places that no man has ever been before. They're going to some place they've been to before, and they're checking up on it, right? And so the Miranda class was excellent for things like that. So, and Starfleet has a big mission because Starfleet's doing a lot of different stuff in that area. It's doing all the survey stuff. It's prepping for war. You know, to a large degree in large parts of that space, Starfleet is the Federation. And so it's got a big mission to do. So that's why I think it's a big question. Okay, I'm going to look at questions and stuff in a little while, but for right now, moving on. So why do I think Star Trek is inconsistent and contradictory? And how do I think it's inconsistent and contradictory? I think it's inherent to the idea of what we would call alpha canon, right? It's inherent to the TV show movie format in that you've only got a certain amount of time to do stuff, and they have a tendency to sort of abbreviate their way through it. We see that in, what is it, Star Trek First Contact, where the Enterprise is at the Romulan neutral zone and it makes it back to Earth in like an hour or something like that, which is just insane, right? The writers are not necessarily versed in all the details. They do what they need to make it work for the episode. So like in the second pilot, the Enterprise needed to go to the edge of the galaxy. Whereas if you look at any proposal that anybody ever gave for how fast warp speed works, that is a voyage of months, if not years. Even if you're going up and down, right? Even if you're going the narrow disk way in the disk of the galaxy, it's still a voyage of months. And it didn't take them months to do that. So I think the writers don't care about that sort of stuff, and they don't necessarily follow the details. For Next Generation, it's clear it was the art department that cared about that stuff. It was Sternbach and Okuda that cared about that stuff. The writer's room didn't care nearly as much. Now, Andy Presby points out to me that he saw an interview recently with Ron Moore that basically said they were doing just-in-time writing in that show, that they're like feeding pages of script to the actors while they're shooting the episodes. So, hey, I get it. If they don't have, a lot of times I think what we're seeing is something that they spent 10 seconds thinking about because they didn't have time to spend any more about. That's fine, right? And as always, I'm not saying you shouldn't like the show because of things like this. I'm just saying this is why we have problems with it. And it changes over time. They weren't consistent. I mean, they didn't, people would make up what they needed at that particular time. Just because some other writer had said something, that didn't mean that they followed it. Beta canon, all the books and other things, has all the same problem. And fanon, I think, is even worse because the fanon people are not writing in the same universe. They're each inventing their own little universe that happens to have a Star Trek flavor to it, and they call Star Trek. That isn't a criticism. It's just simply a statement of fact. And I like a lot of those universes, like the Mastercom data center stuff, the ships of the fleet stuff, I think is absolutely fantastic. But is that the same universe as like Next Gen or even the movie era? No, not really. That's a different universe where Starfleet is much more militaristic, and they're building lots of ships that look a lot alike. Whereas most Starfleet designs have a tendency, stuff we see on screen has a tendency to sort of differentiate itself from each other. So from that standpoint, I think that we can't find the answer looking in one of those other sources. Okay, so how big is the Federation really? Well, there's lots of sources and there's lots of answers. We've got a couple of books out there. There's a Star Trek cartography book that has a bunch of maps. There's the Jeffrey Mandel's Star Trek Star Charts, has maps in it. Andy Presby has told me that he's a big fan of this, and that there are interesting things buried in this book. If you sort of look at stuff, there's interesting things that sort of that give you an indication how Mandel thinks that warp travel works, and that it's not necessarily the way that other people think that warp travel works. But all of these sources are two-dimensional sources. They all flatten the Federation down. Every now and then you get one that sort of acknowledges the fact that space is 3D. But even if you want to make the argument that it's a disk, so it's bigger in the ecliptic than it is vertically, it still has some differentiation vertically. It's still hundreds, if not thousands of light years, and as a result, thousands of light years. And so as a result, you should expect that there would be some overlap in that way. And what we see is everything squished down to 2D. And so I don't think that these maps really do a good job of explaining how big the problem is. And different sources look at it different ways. If you go back and look at Starfleet, the Starfleet universe, right, the stuff that's based on Franz Joseph, the Starfleet universe, the Federation is huge. It's way bigger than anything we see in something that looks like a canon source. And everything seems to indicate that warp drive is way faster in that universe also. And so, you get a lot of different answers from a lot of different sources. And you see stuff on screen that doesn't necessarily match what the people are saying, and it doesn't match what these other sources are. And they're not consistent. It changes over time. So at some point, I'm going to have to just roll up my sleeves and dive into this and do a serious hardcore analysis of what thing says what about these various sources. But I haven't done that yet, because every time I start down that path, I realize that I could come up with about 12 different answers, but I can't come up with one. So maybe I need to come up with 12 different answers. Okay, so that's just, I don't even remember where this comes from, whether this is from the Mandel work or whether this is from the Star Trek cartography work. But this is one example of a 2D map that shows a whole bunch of Federation stuff, and it's sort of, you see where the Romulans and the Klingons sort of overlap or butt up against each other, and you see where the Federation is with regard to all that. And I have a hard time believing that that there isn't more overlap, that it's that sharp-edged. So Thomas the Cat says it's the stellar cartography map. So thank you very much for that. No, now he's saying it's star charts. Okay, so it's the star charts thing. He knows a lot about Star Trek, so I believe him. So why does the answer change over time? Well, the Federation keeps growing. I think I said that. And Starfleet seems to have a robust building program, right? I think the building program has changed some over time. So I think they were building a lot during the Kirk era because they saw the possibility that they might have to fight a war or two. But I think Starfleet just seems to keep churning out ships, and it keeps ships for a long time. As witnessed by the fact that we see Miranda ships and Excelsiors around in the TNG era, and they continue all the way through Deep Space Nine. Like I said, we all know that the real reason is that the model makers had a lot of models for those ships, and so it was easy for them to do stuff with those ships. But I also think that, like I said, I can tell an in-universe story that they seem to be just, those were hot production lines. They were happy with the design. I would hypothesize that they were modular designs so they could upgrade them. A Miranda today does not look like a Miranda back then. Just like if you buy a brand new F-16 today, you are not getting the same F-16 that came into the fleet in 1976. It is not the same airplane. It just looks the same from the outside, but it is not the same airplane. And these ships, they can keep them for a long time because while they do, stuff do age in space, I think their maintenance is really, really good. And, they're not, unlike the United States Navy, they're not putting it within a corrosive substance that is trying to flex it in 15 different directions at the same time. US Navy ships have an inherent lifespan. Airplanes have an inherent lifespan, although if you over-engineer a plane like they did with the B-52, you can make it last for a long, long time. And so, the Mirandas are sort of the B-52 of Star Trek, and the Excelsiors are a B-52 type thing, in that they were over-engineered for what they needed them for, and they kept them for a long time. And so I think that the fleet is just constantly growing over time. Okay, so what does Starfleet do anyway? What do they need all these ships for? And I would argue, and I have argued in the past, that I think the easiest way to think of Starfleet, comparing it with what we have in the current day, is to view it as being an amalgamation of the Coast Guard plus the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration plus the State Department. So what do I mean by that? The Coast Guard has 5 canonical missions. Now, they don't talk about the 5 canonical missions anymore. They got rid of that from their website. I personally think that's a mistake because I think they had a nice, pithy little way of describing what they do, and they've replaced it with this long list of stuff. But it basically boils down to the following. They do law enforcement, safety at sea, navigation, which like buoys and harbors and stuff like that, fisheries enforcement, which also includes pollution stuff, law enforcement, and national security. So fisheries, safety at sea, navigation and buoys, law enforcement, national security. Those are the 5 missions of the U.S. Coast Guard. So I don't think Starfleet is doing anything that looks like fisheries enforcement. But I do think that they're doing exploration and survey, which NOAA does survey stuff. So they do exploration and survey. They do first contact, which is kind of a State Department-like thing. They do diplomacy, which is definitely a State Department-like thing. They do counter-piracy, counter-smuggling sorts of stuff, probably. And they do safety in space, which includes antimatter stuff. I believe we learn in the Next Gen Tech Manual that Starfleet is the people that produce antimatter. They certainly care about antimatter facilities and would certainly have a responsibility in protecting them. They do navigation and communication. In this case, it's maintaining buoy relays or subspace relays. And they do, Defense of the Federation stuff. So that's a lot of stuff that requires a lot of ships. And most of the ships that we see in Starfleet, the big ships, do seem to have some sort of armament. We occasionally run into like a medical ship that doesn't really have a whole lot. And we occasionally run into science vessels that don't have a whole lot of armament. But most of the ships that Starfleet has do seem to have some armament. And I think that's because it's just like a Coast Guard cutter has a gun. Does it use that gun very often? No, not really. Right? Like if a Coast Guard cutter is out rescuing some people who are in a sailboat that's overturned and, their sail is broken and they can't get the boat over, they don't need the gun for that because they're doing safety at sea stuff, but they got a gun and they can use it if they have to. And so I think basically Starfleet's war reserve is in the exploration fleet. So they don't have the wherewithal to just sort of like build a war fleet that they then have in mothballs and have everybody swap ships if it comes to that. Instead, what they do is everybody's sort of like, okay, now we're going to go to war. We're going to wear the other hat. We're going to perform the other mission. So I think that's really kind of what their approach is to it. So how does Starfleet decide how many ships that it actually needs then? Well, some of you may recall this particular slide from past episodes. This is the building a navy slide. And it starts with the strategic assumptions about what environment you're in. And it goes all the way to how do you manage your force? What are your personnel policies, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is how you decide how many ships you need. And that security environment and fiscal environment tells you what your resources are. Security environment tells you what you need to, what your threats are. And in this case, it includes all the other mission related stuff, like how many ships do you need to do exploration? How many ships do you need to do to have safety patrols, et cetera, et cetera. Like when I worked at the Center for Naval Analysis, we used to do some work for the Coast Guard. And one of the questions was, I forget how many, we had like 52 Coast Guard stations on the coast. And so the question was, why 52? And the answer was that we did a graphic that showed the reason why we did 52. And it had to deal with the range of the helicopter that they used. That it was the minimum number of stations you needed to use to be able to get a helicopter out to a certain distance from shore from along the entire coast of the United States. If you had fewer stations, there would be gaps in your coverage and you couldn't get a helicopter out there to do rescue stuff. And so that just sort of determined what you needed, in the same way that if you're putting up a fence around the perimeter of your property, the number of fence posts you need is going to be determined by the length of the perimeter, right? You get a certain distance for each fence post. That's how many fence posts you need to buy. And so all those mission stuff goes into that security environment thing. And then you need to sort of figure out what you're going to do in that environment. And then you start getting into the weeds about the missions, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think at least in theory, you should be able to at least come up with some assumptions that may or may not be totally consistent with the show, but you can come up with a consistent set of assumptions that will tell you how many ships Starfleet needs at a minimum. And then the question becomes like, okay, if they turn the crank on the Mirandas, maybe part of their plan is to keep Mirandas around longer. And so they don't write them hard and put them away wet. If you need 3 Mirandas at a minimum, but you have 5, you can keep the 5 at a lower op tempo and you can make them all last longer, right? Like if I had 2 cars and I alternated driving the 2 cars, I could expect that they last half as long because I'd put miles on them half as fast. So I think that's kind of how that probably works. So I'm going to go back and take a look at questions and see what we've got here. Scrolling back to the beginning. Bob asked if, he said, I'm curious to know if there will be any new watchers tonight based on recommendations at PhilCon. Bob ran several panels at PhilCon, which is the science fiction convention I was at last week. And as a result of that, he mentioned Starfleet Tactical and gave people the information. And I don't know if anybody from PhilCon who saw it at PhilCon is watching tonight. If you are, please do a shout out in the chat, just so that we got an idea about whether that worked or not. But I appreciate the fact that Bob wanted to do a shout out at the con. Okay, One Horse Shay said that when writing DS9, he said it was 12,000 to 15,000 ships in 2373. Yeah, I mean, that's a number that makes sense to me. I mean, I'm not saying that that number doesn't make sense. I'm just, I'm kind of wondering where that comes from. And the other thing is, as near as we can tell, there's Starfleet Academy. How many graduates, if everybody in Starfleet has gone through Starfleet Academy, how many graduates does Starfleet Academy have to provide enough Starfleet officers for 12,000 to 15,000 ships? Yeah. The US Naval Academy has a graduating class of, I think, around 400. And there's like that. There's more graduates than there are ships in the Navy. Now, of course, there's also airplanes and other stuff like that, but you can expect that there's other jobs in Starfleet also. And so as just a back of the envelope calculation, you might think that their graduating class would have to be 12,000 people. That's a big school. That's a big school. Don't see anything indicating that it's that big a school. So, Dustin said the bookshelf is looking more filled out. In fact, I was having a conversation with Lissa before we started, because right behind me, if you look up there, that is an Honor Harrington Star Knight class ship with the wedge. You can't actually see the ship because it's actually in the middle of that blue stuff. I have on the shelf below, I have a ship that Tom Pope made for me. It's the Jason, which is the colony ship from a David Weber short story that I dropped earlier today, or I knocked it off the shelf, and it's in two pieces there. And then there's also behind that is the wooden sword I got when I left DIA as a going away gift. And unfortunately, because I put it right behind me, when I'm sitting in front of the camera, you can't see any of it. And so I'm going to have to move stuff around to the other shelves so that it can be in the background. And I also need to have some impressive books back there, because that's how people do it, is they have impressive books behind them. So I need to work on that. Okay, let's see. Okay. Yeah, Enterprise era United Earth was spread very, very thin. Yes, very much so. Hello, Delon. How are you? Yeah, it's unclear as to how many, Dustin says that in 2260, Starfleet was about 150 to 300 ships at a time. That's his guess for that. And, this is something that we never really fully appreciate. The Enterprise never went anywhere near Earth. To the best of my recollection, I can't remember where Memory Alpha was. And I guess Vulcan's kind of near Earth, and they did go to Vulcan. But we don't have a good feel. Most of their time was out in the periphery. And we know that ships were really thin out there. In fact, they talk about there's only 12 Constitution class ships, which makes you wonder about, like, okay, there's only 12 Constitution. There's 12, there's like 10 or 11 aircraft carriers. There's other ships in the U.S. fleet other than aircraft carriers. So there's a lot of ships there, right? And there's only, a handful of X class, but there's other ships in the fleet other than, any given particular class. And so it makes you wonder how many other ships there are that they just don't talk about, because all those ships are way over there. None of them are here. Here it's really thin, but that just means that we're on the exploration mission, right? So like if you want to go back to the Age of Sail, the Great Britain, England had a lot of ships in the Channel. It didn't have a whole lot of ships in the South Pacific, but it had a lot of ships in the channel. So if you're just sampling the number of ships in the South Pacific, you might not have a good idea of how big the Royal Navy actually was. Okay, so let's see. Olive said, I tend to assume Starfleet is usually quite a lot bigger than dramatic license and speed of plot implies. Yeah, in fact, talking with somebody earlier today, I'm trying to remember who it was. They made, maybe it was Merle. They made the comment about there was only 40 ships available. No, it was somebody I was listening to online. Actually, I'm sorry, it was a YouTube video that there was only 40 ships available for Wolf 359. And it's like, okay, yeah, that just tells me that everybody's out doing shit, right? They're not. If Earth is part of the core of the Federation and your ship's mostly about being out in the periphery, then maybe you don't have a whole lot of ships at home because your ships are all out on the periphery doing stuff. And the Borg were just able to sort of come in so fast that they caught everybody with their pants down. It's one possible way of looking at it. Delon points out the universe got more complicated due to the Bajoran wormhole. Yeah, and a whole bunch of ships, enemy ships come pouring through that. And, you see Starfleet really begin to change as a result of the Borg, right? You see the Defiant, you see the Steamrunner, you see the Akira, you see all these designs come online that at least are partially influenced by the fact that now we have the Borg, right? So for a long time, the Romulans weren't a factor. The Klingons weren't a factor. They're both approximately at the same tech level of the Federation anyway. And so, the Federation sort of looks at it as, like there's no big deal there. And then the Romulans come back in play again. Okay, so we gotta take the Romulans seriously again. That potentially changes our strategic situation. And then all of a sudden the Borg are there. And the Borg really sort of seemed to light a fire under Starfleet. And I think that a lot of what we see is them going back to design studies that you keep your ship architects busy by coming up with design studies for ships that you're never going to build. And now all of a sudden you're going to build them because now you actually need to build warships. So they start prepping to build warships. And then you have the Dominion War. And so I think the Federation was already going to a war footing because of the Borg when you have the Dominion War break out. And so they were actually relatively well positioned to fight that war because they had already started the crank going. Scrolling. Yeah, Delon points out we never see anybody from a planet that's under the protection of the Klingons. Yeah, we don't. And a friend of mine has made the argument that he thinks that the Klingon Empire is the ultimate meritocracy, in that the Klingons come and conquer you, and they basically say, well, you fought really well when we conquered you, and now you're a Klingon, as far as we're concerned. And so that, the implication of that is that you might have like a Gorn from a Gorn planet that got conquered by the Klingons. You might have a Gorn as a senior minister in the Klingon Empire. We don't see any of that. I kind of like that idea, though. I think that's a really cool idea. And so we'll have to see about that. Yeah, One Horse Shay says the Enterprise 1701 could do 800 light years in 11 hours, and that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It just doesn't. Like on the old warp scale, if you assume it's the cubic scale, it works out that warp 10 is about a light year an hour. I think it's warp 10. I figured it out one time. One of them is about a light year an hour. Yeah, so that doesn't make sense. Let's see. Yeah, speed of plot just agrees with nothing. Eric Henry says, looking forward to Weave Trek. Yeah, I need to do that. I told you all, I asked you all a while ago if it would be okay if I sort of gave you some of my ideas about how I would rewrite things. And I have not forgotten that. I just need to sort of sit down, and I have reasonably extensive notes that I've been doing with all of this. I've been sort of thinking about whether I should just do an episode where I say this is what I would do, or whether I should try to sort of work it in or whatever. I'll probably just end up doing an episode because that makes it nice and self-contained. I clearly have my own ideas about how I can tell the story with this. And I will always say that, there's a lot of inconsistency in Star Trek. And as a result, it gives me a lot of leeway to be able to say, I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to anchor on this, and I'm going to put this other stuff in there, which seems to be logically consistent for me. But it's kind of rare that I just sort of say, like, yeah, I'm going to totally and completely rewrite something that somebody's done, right? I try to do canon that I may not give an explanation that's entirely canon, but I at least want it to be next to canon. I don't want it to be a total violation of canon. And what I'm talking about when I do my alternative Star Trek thing is just basically, it's much more about how I would approach a few things. And some of it is in terms of Starfleet operations, and some of it is in terms of Starfleet technology. And a lot of it is doubling down on ideas that I think are justifiable, but I would sort of like hammer them into stone about how warp drive works and stuff like that. And I just need to do it. I just need to do that. Okay, so let's see. Scrolling. When Horace Shea says there's no slowdown in production after Kittimer, that's a fan and myth. I think that, yeah, I think, the Federation keeps getting bigger, and so you're still going to have to pump out ships. I don't think that necessarily there was a slowdown, but I'm not convinced. I could see with the Klingons not being as a problem anymore, that situation stabilizing, and the Romulans sort of pulling out. I could see a situation where they say, Excelsiors and Mirandas are getting the job done. We don't need to go to the next generation, or we don't need to sort of rush forward. We can just keep turning the crank for what we're doing, because what we need are hulls, right? We don't necessarily need the brand spanking new super whammadime technology solutions, right? We don't need the latest in tech. We don't need to be pushing the envelope on the combat capability side. We just need some hulls. And so they keep turning the crank on the old ones. And as a result, by the time TNG comes around, if there's 12,000 to 15,000 ships in the fleet, how many of those do you think are Mirandas and Excelsiors? If you told me that there were 5,000 Mirandas in the fleet, I could buy that. I could easily buy that. Or that there had been at one point, or that they had built 5,000 over the production run. I could easily believe that. I could believe that there was, at least several thousand of those and at least several thousand Excelsiors, if we're talking about a 12,000 ship fleet. So now that 12,000 ships, 12 to 15,000 is probably also including all the support ships and stuff like that. Although you don't see as many of those in Star Trek as you do in the real world. You don't see anything that looks like an underway replenishment. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. And I'm not going to say it's because of replicators, right? Because the thing that people, as I've said in the past, that people don't understand about replicators is it really does matter what you start with. If you're going to make matter out of energy, just energy, it's incredibly expensive, and that's not really the way it works. But it does mean that you can go to like the Oort cloud and get what you need there to replenish what you've got. And anytime they stop by a starbase, they replenish, and they got really big tanks. Andy Presby recently did the calculation based upon the TNG tech manual. It carries the Galaxy class carries enough anti-deuterium for that ship to operate at like warp 6 for like 18 months straight. So it's got and that's, antimatter is the one thing they can make antimatter on board through the Bussard collectors and some other tricks, but it's not what they want to do, right? It's a very expensive way to do that. It's very slow. And so antimatter is the one thing that they really just can't go to the Oort cloud and get, I don't think. So, okay, let's see. One Horse Shay says the Star Trek RPG extensively writes about how a 24th century Miranda is vastly superior to a 23rd century version. I do have that game. I have not. I assume you're talking about the Modifius game. I have not yet read that part of it, and I'm looking forward to, because that sounds really cool. I like that. Let's see. Yeah, they have to worry about the One Horse Shay also says they have to worry about the Romulan border and the Cardassian border. Then the Borg show up. The Cardassians, I mean, my take on the Cardassians is the Cardassians are a problem in the same way the Iranians are a problem. I.e., they're not the Russians and they're not the Chinese. You got to take them seriously in that they do have some capability, but it's not the A team, right? When it comes to the axis of evil, there's clearly an A team and a B team. And so I think the Cardassians are kind of the B team from a technology standpoint, which is one of the reasons why I think that the Federation solved part of their problem in dealing with the Cardassians by building small ships, small fighter type ships, is because I think they could make those work against the Cardassians. I'm not sure that they could have made them work against the Klingons or the Romulans. I think sending crews in small ships like that would have been a death sentence against the Klingons and the Romulans, but against the Cardassians, I think they can make it work. Okay, still scrolling. It is definitely good to diversify, create more designs for different eras of Starfleet. I like that. Keep it up. Keep up the good work. Yeah, hundreds of years due to, Merle says hundreds of years due to parts replacement or tech becomes obsolete. I think we see some ships disappear because the tech becomes obsolete, but I think other ships, they're getting slowly upgraded over time. My guess is there's a big chunk of Starfleet engineering that is just about engineering new solutions that fit in old hull forms and stuff like that. And so like, okay, we got like, how can we make that engine better by improving parts of that engine, right? And you can do that with cars, right? You can buy a car and you can get aftermarket parts to make your car engine more powerful and things like that. So we do that in the real world. We do that with airplanes, like we will upgrade an airplane from an old standard to a new standard by putting a new radar on it, or maybe replacing the engine or some of the other avionics or whatever. And then every now and then we do something like we're doing with the F-15EX, where it looks like an F-15, but it's fly-by-wire instead of hydraulics, and it's got some monster engines, and it's got a new avionics suite, and it's got a new glass cockpit, and it's got a new radar, and it's got more hard points. And so the F-15EX It's clearly based on the F-15, but it is not your father's F-15 by any stretch of the imagination. It's a much, much, much more capable platform than the old F-15, either the C or the Strike Eagle, the E. Either one of them was. So, one Horse says assumes they have a equivalent of an ROTC program. Could be. I don't think we ever hear of anybody coming out of any commissioning source other than Starfleet Academy. That gets to the entire question of whether they're all officers or not. Gene Roddenberry famously said they're all astronauts, so therefore they're all officers. There's always the question about what is Chief O'Brien? Is Chief a job title? Is he like a senior chief? Is he like a chief warrant officer? At one point, he was wearing a lieutenant's uniform. And so I am a big believer in you cannot answer the question about Chief O'Brien as to exactly what his rank is, because I don't think that they were consistent in how they approached that problem. So I kind of have a tendency to think that he's some sort of warrant officer, and the chief part is an honorific title because he's the transporter chief. And so I think he's something along those lines. Does that mean he went to Starfleet Academy? I don't know. Yeah, I think there's a good chance it's his job title, not his rank. I think it's a good chance it's his job title, not his rank. So, hello, Bill. Were you at PhilCon, Bill? Walter Hunt told me you weren't there. Told me that you weren't running MaltCon, so I didn't try to go look for you. So let's see. He's enlisted because Worf's foster dad was proud that Worf became an officer while he was an enlisted. Yeah. That's the other thing is, did all of those things change because... So first of all, Gene Roddenberry had a tendency to give flippant in-universe answers, which I find very annoying because he created problems for obsessive compulsive people like me. When he was asked why star dates don't go in order, his answer was that it had to do with the speed and location of the ship, and they were taking like relativity into account and all this other stuff, et cetera, et cetera. When the correct answer was, we film them in order, but the network does not broadcast them in order. Okay. That struck me as being a perfectly good answer, Gene. Why didn't you go with that one? And so the entire, they're all astronauts, so they're all officers, strikes me as being a similar sort of flippant in-universe answer. So is that the case of is that an answer that is still the case? Used to be the case, was never the case? Don't know. Oh, Delon, you have COVID again. Don't do that. Stop doing that. You didn't have COVID when I talked with you the day before yesterday. All right. Sorry to hear you have COVID. Let's see. And hello, right? Yeah, warp drive is slow. Warp drive moves at the speed of plot. Yeah. Cisco pointed out, though, Defiant was a direct result of the Borg. I think that one is actually pretty well documented. There's a question about the Akira. I've come up with a plan with what I believe is what's going on with the Akira that I think I've told you about previously. I think that what's going on with the Akira, there may have been an Akira design, but I think they I think shortly after they got the report of the Borg and how the Borg was able to do shield stuff and basically just turn, for all practical purposes, turn off the Federation phasers, they had a meeting and they said, okay, what are we going to do about this? And somebody raised their hand and said, how about we use a shit ton of antimatter? And so let's build something. Let's see how many photon torpedo tubes we can cram on one ship, because we know that antimatter can make the big boom. And so let's just try to make the biggest boom we can. So I think that's what they ended up doing. I think that's where the Akira came from, because it's got like 17 torpedo tubes, if you look at it. Yes, I would agree that whoever said that must have been very handsome. Let's see. I am scrolling. Enterprise speed of plot. Yes. Now, I haven't talked about it in a while. I think I have mentioned to it on the show. I've always had my own little headcanon for Star Trek, is that Star Trek is a 23rd or 24th century TV show about Starfleet. And as a result, it is as accurate. Hollywood is as accurate in the 23rd and 24th centuries as they are today. And so everything that we're seeing about Starfleet is being run through Hollywood. And that's how I kind of justify a lot of this stuff. Yeah, the idea that Kittimer is an analog for the Washington Naval Treaty has some interesting world building possibilities. I don't recall anybody ever saying anything that indicates that the Kittimer Treaty has those implications. The thing about cloaking devices is another agreement, if I remember correctly, which I think is the dumbest agreement known to man, for what it's worth. But yeah, I kind of like the idea that there might be some stuff in Kittimer about what you're. It makes sense that you would do something that was designed to sort of keep tensions low, to give the treaty time to sort of like grow roots. That makes sense. Yeah, Wright suggests that Miranda is the Starfleet Fletcher or the Arleigh Burke in today's day. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Oh, yeah. Okay. Just going through this. Yeah, there's some interesting things on Federation fighters. I have done a show, I think, where I talked about fighters. Pat and I started to have a conversation about fighters one time. I want to get back to that because I think that's an interesting topic. Now, I was talking with Chris Carlson today, and he suggested that a good thing to do would be to compare Starfleet with Traveler when it comes to that sort of stuff. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do it the other way around, because I haven't talked about Traveler yet. That on the list of things to do is to go through everything that Martin Doherty's ever written, and sort of explain how the Traveler universe works and how it ties into Julian Corbett in his Battlefleet versus Flotilla, because it's very clear to me that Martin Doherty has read and internalized Corbett, and how things change, because a lot of Corbett works in 1915 and he potentially works in like 2315, but he doesn't necessarily work in 2025. And the reason for that is because a lot of the stuff that in 1915 would be done with ships, in 2025 is done with aircraft. And so a lot of those missions for small ships go away, because like for instance, in World War II, you didn't really use cruisers for scouting. You really used airplanes for scouting for a lot of that. You used PBY Catalinas, you used ships off of aircraft, or airplanes off of aircraft carriers to do your scouting. You would, if you needed to do something at night, or you knew that you were going to be shooting at surface ships of some sort, you might send cruisers in to do that sort of stuff. But as a general rule, this idea that cruisers are the eyes of the fleet, which is a phrase that if you read naval history, you hear that time and time and time again. Yeah, not in World War II, they weren't. Airplanes were the eyes of the fleet in World War II, and airplanes and satellites and stuff like that are the eyes of the fleet today. And so, but, once you get to the point where you no longer have the differentiation in media, where airplanes are no longer a thing conceptually, then it makes sense that you'd go back to maybe cruisers as being the eyes of the fleet. Yeah, Patrick Ross says, I figure at some point they had to replace the Duotronic computers on the Excelsior and Miranda classes with isolinear chip computers. Yeah, I expect, they make a special point, the canon explanation as to why the bridge is on top and why you see bridges change is that that's a module that they can pull out. And what's directly below in most of the blueprints, what is directly below the bridge? The computer core. And so there's one school of thought that says that that's all one unit, and you just pull that whole thing out, or at least you remove the bridge, and now you can slide the computer core out and put a new computer core in. Now, one of the things that people might ask is, why is that computer core so big, right? It's not like we have big computer cores like that on aircraft carriers, et cetera. And my response to that is the reason why it's so big is that if you go back and read some of the sources, I talk about how that the navigational deflector is a warp device, that it's a subspace generator. So it's got the same sort of DNA as the engines do. There's actually a fourth thing on board that does that, and that's the computer core. The computer core has subspace fields in it so that the computer can operate at faster than light speeds. And that, I believe, is in the Next Gen Tech Manual. Yeah, Delon makes the comment that as far as Starfleet Academy goes, there's probably more than one. I think so, too. Where'd you graduate from? I graduated from, Starfleet Academy, Wapello County campus, something like that. Yeah, there's other references to enlisted, so looks like that it's gone away. So, all right, scrolling down. Oh, this is interesting. I heard that I'm going to throw this up. I heard that in 1936, a U.S. Navy ordnance officer wrote magazine articles on weapons and tactics for space combat. I would love to see that. I would absolutely love to see that. We do, the closest that I know about that is the show Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda had a retired surface warfare officer on staff. And I haven't really talked about Andromeda much recently, but at one point I went through and showed about how they have the 10 canonical missions of the High Guard and give a bunch of ship descriptions, and they rate them according to those 10 canonical missions. And reading through that stuff, I've read a lot of stuff that's written by naval officers, and it reads like something that was put together by a naval officer. It really does. It's really pretty cool in that regard. And that's one of the reasons why I like that show. although that show does clearly have problems. I was making the joke to somebody the other day. Somebody said, how many seasons of Andromeda was there? And I said, that's really like asking the question about how many Highlander movies was there? Because the one answer is that there were 2 seasons of Andromeda, and the other answer is there's 5 seasons of Andromeda. So there's 2 good seasons of Andromeda. Lissa, I'm going to throw that back up. So you actually found it, huh?
There's a couple of things. There's War in Space 1939 too. And then I also found something that's From Sea to the Stars. But this is from 44 to 2009. So this is a different thing too, but it might be worth people looking into.
Yeah, throw that up too. I'm going to look these up tonight. Okay, that sounds good. So let's see. Any last minute questions, anything like that? Oh yeah. Olive says one fun thing about Andromeda was that when they ran out of things like drones or certain weapons, they tended to stay out of them.
Yeah.
Which is there's a YouTube video on about Voyager that shows an initial conversation where Chakotay says we have we have 82 photon torpedoes, and then it proceeds to show every time in the show where they fire photon torpedoes, and it subtracts from the number that they fire, and the final number they end up with is like negative 156. Something like that.
Look. They made some along the way, right?
They stopped. They were just out.
Also, this is not taking into account that there was also the dual universe Voyager, so we don't know how many photon torpedoes made it from that version of Voyager onto the actual one that survived.
That's an interesting hypothesis. I was going to say, they were just driving along and they happened to see, hey, is that what I think it is? And they go closer and there's a big sign that says Photon Torpedo Depot. And so they stopped at Photon Torpedo Depot and bought some photon torpedoes.
Photon Torpedo. Yeah.
And Chakotay makes a point of saying something like, we don't have a way to make any more. So they specifically say, this is what we got. And when we use them, we're done. So.
You weren't supposed to actually count.
Yeah, I think we weren't supposed to actually count. So. Well, that's all I've got. So I think it's time to declare victory. And I would like to say, as
torpedoes
always,
we trust.
I'm sorry, what?
In torpedoes we trust, says right.
In torpedoes we trust. I'm going to put those links up real quick. I'm making sure that I've got the links. Oh, you know what? It truncates the links. So, Lissa, if you would do me the favor of sending me those links.
Yeah.
Send them in Facebook Messenger. Put them in the chat, and I will try to put them into the show description so that people can get them.
Sounds good.
Because I would like to, I intend to go look at that stuff myself too. So, actually, I'll put them in the comments field. If it lets me put them in the comments field. So we'll see.
It should.
Yeah,
But
I think it does, but you never can tell with YouTube because they always change the rules. So I will make sure that those links are available either in the show description or the comments field. The difference between the two of those, as Alyssa knows, but not everybody else might know, is the difference between me just going in as Chris Weuve and putting them in the comments field versus me having to log into the studio version of YouTube, switch over to the Aries Studio user, and then deal with the god-awful YouTube interface to get to it, which is just a pain in the ass to go in and actually make changes that way. But I can do it. Or I might just post them in the blog associated with it, the Aries Studio channel. But in any event, I'll figure out how to get that information to everybody so that you can all do something with it. And with that in mind, all right, let me make sure that I put the rest of the stuff in the chat log that I always save. With that in mind, I think it's time to go ahead and call it. And I would like to say, as I do every time when we finish, that I am always impressed. I'm always humbled and honored. That's the better way to phrase it. I'm always humbled.
oh, we forgot the ticker.
Oh, yeah. Not the opinions of my employer. Images are used for educational purposes and for purposes of criticism. All those images I used, weren't those really cool? Weren't they critically cool?
They were critically cool.
They were critically cool. As always, I am honored and humbled that so many people would take their Saturday night and spend it listening to me bloviate about Star Trek. So thank you very much for coming and looking at it. No show next week. Plan to have a show the week after that. So thank you very much, everybody. See you then.
Live long and prosper, guys.